Thank you for attending. This is great fun for me. In addition to trying to get you all to make larger gifts to support liberty and what we're trying to do for North Carolina citizens, I get to use a little bit of my background in the sports industry. And Ed and I have some commonalities. We had the delightful experience of being invited at the same time to be on the topic. I think it was MLS and sports stadium subsidies and sports finance, and both of us have been involved in that in our past. So afterwards we started talking a little bit, and I'm like, hey, we have similar backgrounds. We sort of believe the same things, sort of libertarians, conservatives, for small government, but we've also done a lot of things outside of public sector and government, but a lot of it has to do with sports. I spent a lot of time working around the NCAA and the NBA, and the ACC in my background early on in my career. So I follow that with interest personally, and obviously with my John Locke Foundation hat on and my libertarian conservative personal views, I followed it with much interest, particularly as of late. Ed has as well, and Ed has a very interesting background, and he's going to share some of that with you. But Ed is a very smart guy, which is important. He has an undergraduate from Duke in economics and in Russian. He has his MBA in finance from the Fuqua School, and he teaches at Duke, among other things that he does. He's also an entrepreneur and a capitalist, bless his heart. But he teaches what I've come to understand is one of the most popular courses at Duke, and that is the economics of sports. And so everybody wants to get into Ed's class. I spoke to his class at one point, and I sat in on his lecture, and I can see why. It's a lot of fun to be in Professor Tiryakian's class. So with that, let me introduce you to Ed Tiryakian.
Thanks, John. It's great to be here. And yeah, we did meet doing Rick and Donna's show, so it's better than Match.com. And I've had the pleasure of working with the Locke Foundation a couple times, and we are two peas in a pod when it comes to our backgrounds of sports, business, capitalism, et cetera, the things that to most of us seem to matter a lot, and to some matter too much, but you're going to get a very good presentation today about the intersection of sports and politics and how it does seem to be skewing in one direction. So,
thanks, Ed. All right, so the topic is the left's attempt to, maybe not. Here we go. Okay. The left's attempt to weaponize sports. There's a lot there, but basically, if you think about ways that the left might try to circumvent processes like the representative process of legislature and representative government, sports would be a great way to do that because obviously there's a large number of people available as a consumer sect. That has lots of implications. So we're going to talk today about some of those implications, some of it having to do with federalism, some of it having to do with what it does to us culturally. We'll talk about HB2 and the governor and a couple of other things, but we're really going to try to analyze this and use the example of ESPN. Because, for one thing, Ed has done a lot of work and research on ESPN's numbers as a corporate finance and economics professor. And I think it helps explain the role that ESPN plays within the overall sort of sports complex. When you think about sports, you think about the distributors of content and the cable companies, and you think about the content providers being the sports themselves, the ACC, the NCAA, the NBA, for example, and how essential the partnership is and the role that ESPN plays. And what's interesting is you look at this, I hope you'll pick up on one theme, and that theme is the sort of in the equation of the business of sports, the most essential component to that is the sports consumer, all of us, what we care about. And we're going to share some data with you that I think might be surprising, maybe even a little counterintuitive. But I've seen this data for a while, and I know it, but it's why it's sort of interesting for us to look at the steps that have occurred and the things that otherwise semi-well-educated people and experienced executives you think would know better, And so in the lens of kind of an economic examination, I think you'll get a good sense for what's going on. And we'll talk about what those implications are long range as well. Yes, sir.
I would like to point out on the research-based, Jay Billis and Jay Williams and all these Duke people have matriculated to ESPN. So I have a lot of sources. I've talked to a lot of anonymous sources, and to date, I have not found any connection with the Russians as concerns sports and sports consumers. But I'll keep looking for you, because that's what I do. I'm here to serve you.
Thank you, Ed. All right, so first of all, we know we've always had sort of a clash with sports and politics. And there's nothing wrong with that, certainly. All of us in this room recognize and value that anyone should be able to express their personal views. And if they have a platform for it, even better for them. And regardless of whether we agree with them, we all support that. So I think that's been the case historically, that you would see an expression of personal opinion, whether it's from an athlete or a team or even a commentator like Bob Costas. But what we're starting to see now is something a little bit different. And that is we're seeing sports organizations and leagues and media partners trying to affect public policy. And that is new. And they're trying to do it at all levels of government. We all experienced it in HB2, for example. The NBA, the ACC, the NCAA, and we'll take a little bit of time to talk about that as part of the role that ESPN plays. But this is particularly bothersome to us when we think about representative government, and we think about the role of federalism. When you have an organization who really is tax exempt, who has a stated mission, which is not necessarily social activism, and they decide that they are going to usurp representative government and usurp the legislative process and economically bully or economically punish a market or a state because they disagree with a particular social view or piece of a law or a piece of legislation. And so regardless of your view on transgender rights or LBGT or any of that, really this is a view on representative government and whether or not it is appropriate for the leagues, particularly those organizations like the ACC and the NCAA, who act really as sort of legally sanctioned economic cartels in the way they go about sharing the monies that they generate and dispersing those on a previously agreed upon scheme. I mean, that's sort of a classic economic cartel definition. And so they're not really, as some people would say, an organization that is a trade association, and therefore they should be lobbying for the other members. When a trade association would let anybody join. I've been on a board of a trade association before. These are not trade associations. And these are really economic cartels that we are allowing to operate tax-exempt status, which is fine if they're carrying out their mission. This is the question that's before us now, is whether or not this is an appropriate mission and whether or not it's appropriate to take the steps they have in this regard. So let's let the professor talk to us a little bit about sports business. It's very big, as you can see, and only getting larger, which I think is why we are where we are today.
And to revisit real quick the ban by the NCAA on all North Carolina events after HB2, I pointed out, the NCAA is, as we call it, an incidental cartel. There really is no competition if you want to be an amateur and play sports. You can do the Olympics, but it's every 4 years. You don't get the television coverage, etc. When the NCAA, when North Carolina passed HB2, and this is not a pro or con HB2, this is just a sovereign state passing a law. It was 4.5 months later that the NCAA decided that North Carolina did not change the law, and they banned all events. At the same time, the ACC banned all events, and within a week of that, the NBA decided to pull the All-Star game. That's troublesome from a lot of different perspectives. It's not about the law, it's about the right of a state to say this is what we choose to do. And the NCAA has their own issues. They don't pay their athletes. Whether you think they should or they shouldn't, it's irrelevant. But if you want to know sort of that classic dodge where you take this one colored ball and throw it over here so people look at that and they don't look at this other colored ball over there. This is basically what the NCAA does because they're under such pressure to pay their athletes. It's a $1 billion franchise, et cetera. And I pointed out to John that the Jerry Sandusky trial, which was a pedophile who was molesting children under the auspice of Penn State, it took the NCAA 3 years to rule on that. It took them 2 years with Rick Pitino and the Louisville basketball program to come out and say, hey, we think that's kind of bad what you did. Now, this is after the book had already come out detailing everything that had been done. And I know I must have some dear Tar Heel fans. We're such a wonderful symbiotic group, Tar Heels and Blue Devils. But for all you Tar Heel fans, as you know, it's been 7 years since the NCAA investigated the AFAM scandal that has, sort of polarized the community. It took the NCAA and the ACC and the NBA 4.5 months to rule that North Carolina gets nothing. That's kind of where you sort of get worried a little bit about not having this one system in check. And I also pointed out that it happened to happen during an election year where the governor of our state was in a very tough re-election campaign, and there was 4.6 million votes cast, and he lost by 4,000 and change. And you have to think to yourself, when North Carolina lost all of the ACC, all of the NCAA, and the NBA All-Star Game, you have to think 4,000 votes had to be affected out of 4.5 million. That worries me a lot from a free market guy, which that's what I am. That, you can now sort of institute political judicial activism from institutions that are in effect tax-free. As John said, sports is big business. This is the class I teach, so if any of you want to take it, I'd be glad to have you lecture in there. But it's $500 billion in the U.S. alone. It's over $1 trillion globally. And the average NFL team is now worth $2.4 billion. And that's a compounded annual growth rate of 15%. To put that in market perspective, stock market grows about 6% a year. It's much better off to own an NFL team if any of you can. I recommend it strongly. The revenue of the leagues and the NCAA is about $40 billion a year. It's bigger than Facebook and Twitter combined. Well, Twitter, who cares? But Facebook, a lot of people use. And last year, 92 out of 100 of the most watched shows in 2016 were sports related. You might ask, well, what were the other 8? Well, there happened to be these debates between Trump and everyone else, and then Hillary and Trump, and that was 4 of the. So there's about 2 that were in top 100. One was the Emmys, and one was the Oscars. I don't care about either one. So, so what's changing? So the NFL has had this constant growth rate, both in their franchise value and their revenue. Last year was the very first year they saw viewership down. Monday Night Football on ESPN down 13%. The NBA viewership down 15%. Major League Baseball is up 5%. And Fox Sports is up 17%. There's a theme here. I'm not going to bore you with details. But SportsCenter, ESPN's flagship program, was down 15% last year. Golf Channel and Tennis Channel were 2 of the only 4 sports channels that saw viewership up. And you ask yourself, wonder why that is. Could it be because golf and tennis don't happen to mention Colin Kaepernick? It's a very good possibility. Here's ESPN's problem. From a purely economic standpoint, you have a couple things. You have supply and demand. You have a product that you have to produce. ESPN went out and paid a lot of money to show you Monday Night Football, to show you the NBA, to show you the NCAA, SEC, ACC. And then they lost in the span of 3 years about 17 million subscribers. They're losing 10,000 subscribers a day. Just one second. And this is sort of, now, the other thing I teach is economics. So I know there's nothing you'd rather do than be in a room with an economist. I'm not that type of economist. I'm kind of like the common sense economist. But this is generally bad if it's your revenue. This is generally bad if you're this is your costs. So when your revenue's going down and your costs are going up, and I'll hearken you to this. This is a demand curve. What does it mean? Simply put, it goes that way. Why? Because when stuff is expensive, we don't want it. When stuff is cheap, we want it. This is the opposite. It's a supply curve. If stuff is cheap, we don't want to make it. If you're going to pay me a lot, I'll make a lot of it. And somewhere in the middle is where everything meets and we're all very happy. ESPN has said, and the head of ESPN is a English lit major from UNC, so he obviously knows business. He said, I got a better idea. Economics be damned. I'm going to raise prices as I lose subscribers. That'll show them. So the analogy I would paint to you would be, let's say I'm the Ford Motor Company, and I got this great car called the Taurus. I don't even know if they make Taurus anymore, but let's say we do. And I'm selling Tauruses for $20,000 a year. And one day, I used to sell 10,000, now I sell 9. Now we in this room, who took Professor Tiryakian's class, would say, you better lower the price. No, ESPN said, we'll show them, we'll raise the price of the Taurus. So they raised the price of the Taurus from 20,000 to 40,000. What do you think happened? They sold less Tauruses. They have less subscribers. This is the problem when an English lit major is head of a $50 billion company. So they want to blame it on what we call cord cutting. Have we heard that expression? This is where young people, not me, have learned to use their phone to get every type of sporting event that there is. I'm that old TV guy that just, why is it raining? Why did I get my cable signal? Panic time. No, this new group, what do? They get phones. They got everything streaming live, whatever. And ESPN said, see, it's not our fault. It's these darn millennials you keep hearing about. These snowflake millennials, they don't want to pay for anything. So, this is why we're losing all these subscribers. Go back. Yep. So the answer to that is, well, how come Netflix keeps gaining new people? And they're not just gaining new people. They're gaining 5-10 million a quarter every 3 months. Now, this is the old, I'm not going to go back and quiz you on this, but this is the old supply and demand curves. Guess what? Netflix said, if we have something that people want, they're probably going to buy it. It's an interesting concept in econ. That's why I have a master's in finance. And this is what Netflix said. We're just going to make good stuff that people want to watch. Now, I don't watch Orange is the New Black. I don't watch House of Cards, but I have a lot of friends, even my age, who love that stuff. And this is what's happened. In the same time that ESPN has lost 20 million subscribers at $7 a month or $100 a year or $2 billion, Netflix just keeps taking off. Why? They're making stuff people want to see. And this is where our friend John Skipper, the UNC grad, I apologize to all the UNC people. I don't ascribe him to you. He's a different type of person that said, hey, I have an English lit grad, and I think I can figure out business, and I'm going to shift everything to the left because I think that's what people want to see. And if you, I should ask, does anyone here watch ESPN? I'm sure there are. ESPN would like to send you a present if you leave your address. They're so glad to still have you. But this is sort of what John Skipper has said. And if you watch, and I'm agnostic when it comes to this stuff. I'm a numbers guy, I promise you that. But if you watch it, it is clear. It is just repetitive, sort of provocative, progressive agendas that they just push and push and push. And we know there's a man named Curt Schilling who used to be a great pitcher for the Red Sox, go Red Sox, and he got fired because he criticized Hillary. And you don't see the same thing on the other side. So we can say that it's a conspiracy, we can say it's the way things are headed, but this is the ESPN example, and I'll tell you why it matters. Michael Jordan, the greatest of all time. Not LeBron James. It is Michael Jordan. He once famously said when he wouldn't come out politically to endorse Harvey Gantt and that great run between him and the great Jesse Helms, he came out and said, "Why won't you do it? Because Republicans buy sneakers too." That's the old era of sports. They understood we were there to watch them play sports. This is the growth rate of ESPN, because they were showing highlights and there was no political discourse. This is why he will be sort of lionized among people. There is no sort of group that says Michael Jordan should have been more political, therefore he's not a great basketball player. There are a lot of people who would say that LeBron James is too political. He went out on the campaign stump with Hillary Clinton. He said we have to defeat Donald Trump. If we win the NBA championship, I'm not going to go to the White House. You just didn't hear that from Michael Jordan. And this is what a lot of people liked about Michael Jordan.
There you go. I'll jump in here. Yeah, Ed is exactly right. I think this proves not only was he and I agree with your assessment, the greatest basketball player that ever lived, but also pretty damn smart, right? He understands how he gets paid. He understands viewership. He understands the popularity of a sports star. He understands the viewers are not just some, and the data that you're going to see next are actually quite a bit of right-leaning people who view sports. In fact, it makes you scratch your head even more about Skipper's decision and ESPN's turn to the left when you think about content and viewership. This is pretty interesting. So there's some slides that have come out of some long-term data. The next one I'll show you is in television viewership. But what you see here is, if you think about, this is the center line of voter turnout. So everything below this axis is low voter turnout. Everything above this axis, high voter turnout. Everything to the left skews to the left, Democratic skew. Everything to the right, Republican skew. So if you look at this, and just this won't surprise you, but if you are running a campaign for a candidate, do not buy media in WWE or Extreme Action Sports or European Soccer or Monster Trucks or MLS. That's pretty low voter turnout. If you're trying to reach high voter turnout and you're working for a Democrat or someone who is center-left, the NBA would be a good place. The WNBA would be a good place. The NBA, not so much. Left, and the size of the sphere means the size of that audience, by the way. So it's a decent-sized sphere, but it's fairly low on voter turnout. The WNBA is a little higher. Women's tennis a little higher, but a smaller audience. Men's tennis, similar. Horse racing. That pretty much does it. We are, sports fans, a center-right, high voter turnout audience. NASCAR, not surprising, views pretty far to the Republican skew. So we'll eliminate that, and we'll look at all these big spheres here. This represents a large percentage of the sports audience. It represents a fairly decent size that are slightly right of center, which is not surprising to you probably. This is the NFL. This is the Olympics. This is Major League Baseball. This is high school sports. This is college basketball. This big thing is college football, almost as large as the NFL. ESPN pays lots of money for the audience that they are then trying to sell to corporate America that they deliver. This is the NHL. And then up here, the most conservative, the highest voter turnout of any sport, and those of you that are golfers will not be surprised, the PGA and the LPGA. All of that's interesting, but all of it clearly tells you that if you're trying to reach a sports audience, it's probably not a good thing to have a progressive agenda. So it's interesting to me. It also makes you scratch your head until Ed tells us that Skipper is an English Lit major. Here is audience programming. This is all television. Same thing. Average voter turnout, low voter turnout below the axis, high voter turnout above it. This is for all types of programming on television. Left side of the axis, Democrat, right side, Republican. So again, if you're trying to reach, to reach people that might vote for your Democratic candidate, you probably want to avoid music videos, reality dating shows, kid shows, daytime soaps, court shows, daytime talk shows, game shows, movies. Not very effective. However, if you're trying to reach a left-leaning audience or a center-left audience, late morning news is not bad, late night talk, local evening news. Interestingly, documentaries right down the middle, because the documentary is high voter turnout, but obviously it depends on what the topic is. Split right down the middle. But over here, surprisingly, this big sphere is sports. High voter turnout skews to the right. Religious programming and national network news. So again, if you're trying to think about how to reach a conservative audience, you go to sports. Again, sort of intuitive, but also really questionable if you're ESPN. I'll let you walk through this slide.
And I mentioned before about Curt Schilling fired, but this just sort of shows you that these are the percentage of viewers who have noticed that there's something going on at the mothership. And this is as clear as it can be that, you know, the feeling of bias, even among Democrats who watch the show and say, yeah, it is a little bit. I mean, you know, the Republicans have dropped off the face of the map. And there's a couple of events that ESPN clearly knew was not just going to be controversial, but was going to alienate some viewers, is when they named Caitlyn Jenner as the ESPN Sports Person of the Year for bravery. Although he hadn't been in sports for 25 years. And they said, this is a bit odd, isn't it? And then Curt Schilling, for complaining that Hillary Clinton should be put in jail, that's what he said, they fired him that quickly. And the antithesis of that, of course, is all the announcers who have called for Trump's impeachment and his assassination on ESPN, and they don't even get a 2-day hiatus. So that's why you feel the alienation. This is sort of the ESPN Titanic ship going down. And as it goes down, and as I say, they were worth $50 billion to Disney 3 years ago. Today, the estimated value of ESPN is $5 billion. Now, I'm from that school that $1 billion is still a decent amount of money. I mean, it takes me a while to come up with it, but $45 billion, it's going to take me forever to come up with it, as it will for Disney to come up with it. And this is, as ESPN sinks, and the entire ESPN bandwagon says it's not left-leaning. We don't have bias. It's because people are cutting the cable. So, as I said here, they've hit the iceberg, and they keep saying, no, it's not about the iceberg. It's about the way passengers perceive ship travel. That's why we're going down. No, at some point, it's the iceberg. Trust me. And, you know, I've said this before, when you think about responsibility, and you think to yourself, when Secretary Clinton ran for office and lost, she lost because of the Russians. She lost because of Comey. She lost because Trump was inciting riots. But she didn't lose because she ran a bad campaign. We know that. This is ESPN. They're lost because people are cutting cable. They lost because NBA viewers have changed. They've lost because, but it's not because we keep coming out with political dialogue. It's the same. It's really sort of, and like I said, I'm a dollars and cents guy. When I lose $45 billion, I really start to look around the house to see where it is. That's just my nature.
Thank you, Ed. So just to Ed's point here, to bring a little bit of data to ESPN's denial that they have any sort of bias. And by the way, not data here, but more just sort of our anecdotal information. We have some associates and some friends who are involved and have been and are currently at ESPN, whose names will not be divulged. But I will tell you, they have said, and obviously in the strictest confidence, they were told, don't bring conservative views. When you're covering ESPN, those are your personal views and they're not welcome here. And so we know this is the case, but we can't go around talking about how important this is to our liberty and to federalism and talk about some anonymous person, although that works for some people. Anonymity doesn't necessarily work when we're looking at the data, but this works really well. And this is recent data that came out from an organization called Deeproot. They looked at 250,000 viewers of ESPN. They've been around for a long time doing data service analysis. They looked at 43 markets in the U.S. They compared 2015 and 2016 audiences. And in 36 of the 43 markets, they found ESPN viewership became more liberal, between 5 and 27% more liberal between 2015 and 2016. And what that means is conservatives started turning it off, going somewhere else. There's no other explanation for that sort of data. So when total audience, cable television generally, and ESPN in particular are shrinking, you would think embracing this sort of politicization of sports is kind of like adding water to the metaphorical ESPN ship. It doesn't make a lot of sense, but it's pretty evident that's what's been going on. So as we bring this to a close, we've been talking about ESPN as an example, but the weaponization of sports, and let me give credit to National Review's David French, who wrote an article in 2016 and coined weaponization of sports. So we're borrowing that in deference to David French. I think it's a great example and a great explanation of what's going on. But it's not just bad for ESPN, it's bad for all of us. As I mentioned before, the ACC, the NCAA are operating as economic cartels. They're not a trade organization. They economically bully a state like North Carolina, for example, in the name of political activism. That undermines federalism, that usurps the process of representative government, and we're all subsidizing those events. And you think about the subsidies that go to public universities, you think about the subsidies that go to public facilities where these sports events take place. That's why we think it's a serious issue. And these are finally, in closing, the 10 reasons why we think you should care about the left weaponizing sports. Federalism, we need competition among the states. We're having the people's voice through their elected representatives usurped by this sort of behavior. Economic bullying, at the end of the day, ends up, in the name of helping those who need the help, it ends up punishing them. If you think about when you don't have an event, the people that are punished are the small business owners and the people that need to work part-time at those events. It's also sort of part of the political correctness debate that's going on, and we all know that political correctness quells a civic debate or civil debate. This idea of using cultural pressure is obviously part of the arsenal of the left versus persuasion. We would rather have things out in the open and have us talk. Let's then elect and let's decide to let people pass laws, and if we don't like those laws, then we're going to vote for someone else to come in and change that, versus, as Ed said, this sort of political pressure that then immediately demands a change using economic bullying. Another issue here is just the focus on class and focus on special classes, which is part of this weaponization as well. As we all know, that sort of diminishes the accomplishments of folks who are actually minority classes. It also diminishes the rights of the individual. And we all know Ayn Rand said the greatest minority is the individual, and if we focus on what the individual rights are, we don't need to worry about creating special classes of people. As Ed and I know, the sports industry is a major economic driver. It is big business. And so it's driven by consumers, and if we over-politicize it, we can harm it, as the data just showed. People are turning off ESPN. If they turn off sports, that has a trickle-down effect, and it can impact industries. It can impact the ACC, the NCAA, the NBA. Ed and I have talked about sports valuations, for example. We're at all-time highs. The compounded annual growth rate of not just NFL but other sports franchises has been growing at a tremendous rate, and there's a lot of wealth that's been created. Without having the audience, without continually having that to give you the media rights, which is what has been fueling the valuations, we could see valuations start to drop. And that becomes very interesting when the wealthy are at the board meetings at the NBA and they start discussing what the mission of the NBA is, and they're starting to look at what the balance sheet and what the valuation of their NBA franchise is. Maybe a different discussion at the NBA. I mentioned before this idea that we have sports as a way that we escape, and sports as a way that we all come together, even though we may be left or right. If we're Tar Heel fans, we're together when the Tar Heels are playing. If we're Duke fans, we're together when Duke is playing. And this obviously puts that asunder. And I mentioned subsidization. In certain circumstances, we are all subsidizing this. We're fueling something that's combating what we believe in, and that's why, again, we think this is really important. And finally, as a father of four, young people are really influenced by athletes and celebrities. And so we're all for more discussion, more argument, personal views, free expression. But that's not what we're talking about now. We're really talking about these institutions weaponizing sports and then using it in order to circumvent us and circumvent our representative process.